The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. As with in-person hearings, and I'm delighted to see we're largely in-person, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted unless recognized by the chair and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Good morning, and thank you all for joining this hearing. This hearing is entitled Imbalance of Power, How Market Concentration Affects Worker Compensation and Consumer Prices. I welcome our witnesses and, as always, hope we get a good, robust back and forth to elucidate some of these issues. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I can rarely recall a hearing in which I've been so intrigued, interested, and to some extent confused by the topic at hand. The economy is a radically different economy than it was when I was a lot younger in high school. The companies that stood astride the world, companies like GM, Pan Am, some don't exist anymore, and those that do often have market capitalizations a fraction of the companies that stand astride the world today. The unicorns, many of which, by the way, we don't actually pay for their services, at least with dollars. My 12-year business career says that we should absolutely celebrate the success of those world-beating companies and support it. But the moment that those companies or small companies or isolated companies use their heft to squeeze workers, to take out entrepreneurial competition, or to seek excess profits, that's when we get pretty interested, and where a fair and free market and the demands of economic prosperity available to all Americans require that we step in, as we have for a century in this space. But obviously it's a very different economy. Now, why I'm intrigued and interested is it may be possible that it's not primarily the unicorns that we should worry about. I noted with great interest that Amazon, for the first time, I guess, ever, organized labor effort has succeeded there. I also am aware of the fact that Amazon apparently commits to pay all of its employees $18 an hour and have a program to send their people to college. So there's obviously something interesting going on there that is beyond just paying the average or above the average wage. And by the way, it may be possible that some of the worst offenses here are not in the companies that I'm talking about of very high profile. Maybe it's chicken production on the eastern shore of Maryland, or maybe it's the one employer in a community I have never heard of in some state that I haven't spent a lot of time in. So this is why I'm intrigued and really interested in this. I do note, however, I've been doing this for a while, and I have had business after business after business visit me in my office, and rarely is a business visiting me to demand a true free market. Most often, it is there to demand protection, subsidy, or laws which slant the playing field in their direction. I think it's our job to suss out those instances. Again, we celebrate success, but if concentration is damaging American prosperity because companies are squeezing workers, taking out competition, or enjoying excess profits, it is right that the Congress take that up. With that, I would like to thank Ms. Jayapal, whose thinking and work, in many cases bipartisan work, is responsible for this hearing, and offer her 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding to me, but also mostly for actually holding this hearing. I am incredibly excited that we are talking about this today because after my work in the Antitrust Subcommittee, I'm really clear that corporate concentration has a catastrophic impact on consumers, workers, and small businesses in two important ways: monopoly power and monopsony power. When corporate concentration results in monopoly power, where just a few companies dominate the market, those corporations have the power to drive out other competition, including mom and pops and small businesses, which then allows them to raise prices and virtually eliminate the opportunity for consumers to find alternative products. And during the pandemic, we saw prices for essential items like baby food and beef and coffee and bread skyrocketing. On the other side, with monopsony power, we also see how market concentration impacts America's workers by leaving workers with no other options for employment, which then allows companies to lower wages and undermine employee bargaining power, require workers to sign restrictive non-compete agreements, they collude with their competitors to fix wages, force workers to endure harsh working conditions, and stifle efforts to unionize. All of this corporate concentration has a direct impact on widening economic disparities, making workers, consumers, and small businesses unable to bargain for fairer wages, lower prices, or a sustainable market share. And to make matters worse, the abuse of power is more prevalent in industries that disproportionately employ marginalized groups, and I think that's important, such as rural communities, women, and people of color. For example, the growing concentration of large hospital conglomerates limit job choices and wage growth for nurses, administrators, and pharmacists. Meatpacking industry, rural communities are dominated by one entity. And as vice chair of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, I just recognize the ways in which corporate monopolies impact all of these entities. We passed a bipartisan antitrust package, Mr. Chairman, out of the Judiciary Committee, and I'm really excited today to look at this issue here in this committee and see how we can address the widening inequality. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding today's hearing. I think we actually have a really interesting opportunity to look at the data and separate where the data takes us from some of the hyperbole. In particular, I think we have an opportunity to discuss the impacts of economies of scale, the impact both on consumers and on wages. In some industries, large scale is often helpful in reducing costs and keeping prices low for consumers. You can go back in history, look at Ford Motor, for example, in the early 1920s, when it was at its peak. Ford produced more than half the cars in our country and constantly worked to increase the scale of production and keeping prices down to make cars affordable. And at the same time, Henry Ford doubled the pay for his workers to $5 a day. And so it makes you think, what would have occurred if we had implemented antitrust law against Ford at that time? Would we have seen economies of scale? Would we have seen reduced prices? Would we have seen rising wages, or would we not? And what lessons can we take from that? Recently, some of my colleagues have pushed the use of antitrust law to break up some of the largest scaled firms in this country. That same law could have broken up Ford 100 years ago when it was leading the market, but the federal government, we can go back in history, ultimately did not. And what lessons can we learn from that? Every company that competes in particular in a large-scale market doesn't inherently need to be broken up. I think a more recent example than Ford might be BlackBerry. BlackBerry used to be the dominant player in the early smartphone market just a couple decades ago. I used to have a BlackBerry phone. They had a large manufacturing scale, a wide customer base. By show of hands, anybody have a BlackBerry in their pocket right now? Yeah, previously, yes. Right now, seeing no hands. And so I think we have some lessons to learn from that as well. And maybe what is the role of competition in that market space, whether or not Apple, Samsung, Google, also selling phones. What lessons has that taught us? Or you can go back and you can look at Standard Oil, a company whose behavior really destroyed competition, jacked up prices, and hurt consumers. And what was being done probably warranted antitrust engagement. In what conditions are we seeing today that are lessons that we can examine? I think we have to ask ourselves in particular, where do we draw the line, in particular on the use of antitrust law? And I think it's something I'm really looking forward to discussing today. Some industries require large scale to compete efficiently. Products are complex, require hundreds, if not thousands, of parts and skilled workers to assemble them. I think of a jumbo jet made by Boeing. Their product requires large amounts of capital for materials and hundreds of workers to assemble it. They also contract with small businesses that employ dozens of workers, including companies back in my home state of Wisconsin, for specialized components. And so what impact does that have on workers? How does it affect wages? What's the impact on consumers? I looked some stuff up on Boeing for sake of my interest. Entry-level Boeing analyst would make somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 a year. Project manager, north of $100,000 a year. What are the lessons we can learn from a large global company like that, more or less probably a duopoly with them in Airbus, maybe a growing competitor in China. And so people like to criticize some of these large global companies. You also hear Amazon criticized often. Have made it possible to order anything online, have it at your door in 2 days. They deliver efficiently. Business operates at a large scale, and they employ thousands of workers. How is that scale impacting consumers? How is it impacting workers? At home in Wisconsin, they're a large employer, like they are in many places across the country. Amazon employees are currently making north of $15 an hour, as the chairman also referenced in his remarks. So if these companies don't offer competitive wages, what's happening in the labor market? Will they ultimately lose workers, as I would suspect? It would ultimately hurt their ability to compete. And what we're seeing now is actually a pretty tight labor market. We get into long discussions about people on the sidelines, but overall, it's a tight labor market. And how are these business practices impacting getting people back into the workplace? You know, a person can fly home from Washington, D.C. to Wisconsin in a few hours because of what Boeing builds, a journey you couldn't have done 100 years ago from this same building that we're in. Someone in Kenosha can get virtually anything they want at their door within 2 hours because of Amazon's efficiency. Couldn't have happened even 20 years ago. But there's pros and cons with all of this, and there's pros and cons both on the consumer for receiving a lower cost product, and there's also impacts on workers. And I think what's important here is we don't take any one data point and draw a trend line. I think we explore the data and determine where it takes us. And so, Mr. Chairman, look forward to today's hearing. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and before we turn to our witnesses, the committee has developed a quirky tradition of trying, at the chairman's request, to highlight the voices of the people that we're talking about. In the service of that goal, we've done a field hearing in Lorain, Ohio, which was terrific. We'll be going out to the Tuesday, we'll be going out to the wilds of Wisconsin for hearings led by the ranking member and by Ms. Moore of Milwaukee. And we also just, again, try to start every hearing with the voices of those people that we are talking about. So I ask for unanimous consent to play a 4-minute video with a number of people discussing their experiences relevant to this hearing. Thank you. Let's play that video.
When you see, you know, your coworkers, but also your dear friends being exploited throughout a pandemic, it kind of wakes something up in you. Before we unionized, I did not feel like I had much power at all. We were put through such an aggressive union busting campaign by our company. In reality, they were telling us the same lies that union busters have been telling since the 70s at least. We've seen improvements to how workers are being treated. For example, shortly after the election, we were given a $1 raise. It's just through speaking up and kind of demanding that my voice be heard that I was able to have a little bit of security. It's really only solidarity that can win a fight when you're the one without the pocketbook.
So I started the business because I worked in the raw material supply chain. And so I was very good at finding raw material for places like Honeywell. And then they start asking me to add value. Okay, instead of just buying me a bar, why don't you take that bar and cut it into pieces for me and then supply me the pieces? We have the value, we have the expertise to kind of do things that smaller and medium size and even some large business, they don't want to handle that raw material supply chain. They want to just pay somebody to get them the part, the blank, and just deliver it to the dock, and then they can work on the the precision manufacturing that they are, that they excel at. There's so much capital required, and everybody's got their little spot that nobody can cover that entire breadth of manufacturing. It would be very hard to, I think, to vertically integrate.
A lot of people at the beginning did think that money was the driving force behind why we're unionizing, but it couldn't be further from the truth. It's about making sure that our patients are protected, that we have enough people on the floor to care for these patients. I got into nursing, fell in love with it, fell in love with the patients, and specifically the ICU. We don't have enough staffing so that everybody can take a break. This means that some days I'm at work going 12 hours and maybe using the restroom once a shift. I just had 2 kids the past few years, and something that stressed me a lot at work is the inability to pump breast milk because of time and resources. It makes you feel like, why am I taking a job that's compromising like my ability to feed my child? But at the end of the day, I really do love my kids. Really do love my patients, and I want to do both, but I want to be able to do both safely. Immediately, once the hospital got wind of our unionization efforts, they hired consultants from an out-of-state company to come in. It's really devastating, actually, to know that a lot of these problems, like safe staffing, break coverage, ratios, all of that could be fixed. Organizations are choosing not to fix those problems. It's not just about us, but our patients deserve the best care possible.
Thank you again. Now we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Dr. Kate Bourne, Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Heidi Sherholz, President of the Economic Policy Institute. Then we will have Mr. Michael Mitchell, the Director of Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative. Following, we'll have Dr. Hal Singer, who's Managing Director at Econ One Research. And we will close with Mr. Ryan Bourne, the R. Evan Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. For those, and I guess we don't have any remote witnesses, but when you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of the other witnesses and the committee members. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Bourne, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth for inviting me to testify. My name is Kate Bourne. I'm the Director of Labor Market Policy and Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We seek to advance evidence-based ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. Core to this mission is understanding the ways in which inequality slows growth and hurts all of us. As the economy swiftly recovers from the coronavirus pandemic, now is the time to leverage recent gains in the U.S. labor market to address the stubborn, long-standing problems of income inequality and wage stagnation. These problems are what economists call market failures, deviations from how the economy would perform if markets were truly competitive. Today I'll explain the factors that lead to a non-competitive labor market, known as monopsony, and the effects that corporations of taking this power. As Representative Jayapal noted, monopsony sounds like monopoly because it's a similar phenomenon. Instead of a sole seller of a good or service being able to charge exorbitant prices, which is monopoly, monopsony is about the power of a sole buyer of a good or service, in this case labor or workers, being able to unfairly drive down prices, in this case wages. Economists have found that monopsony power is rampant in the labor market, allowing companies to undercut wages. And one point I really want to drive home is how this is intrinsic to the labor market, because workers are just different than other things that are bought and sold. One recent survey of all the economic research on monopsony finds that employers have a power to keep wages more than 1/3 lower they would be in a perfectly competitive market. And firms can use monopsony power to lower workers' wages for a variety of reasons. First, when they have few potential employers, so there's high concentration. Second, when they face job mobility constraints, the ability to easily move between jobs. Third, when they can only gather imperfect information about employers and jobs. Fourth, when they have divergent preferences for job attributes. And fifth, when they lack the ability to bargain. For example, one estimate finds that 60% of U.S. local labor markets are highly concentrated, and this accounts for 20% of all employment in the United States. And on the point of divergent preferences for job attributes, preferences is not quite the right word. They're actually constraints, such as a primary caretaker in a family requiring a job that aligns with a child's schedule, or a worker who's more likely to face a hostile work environment, making job choices based on avoiding harassment rather than the best possible income they can earn or the best use of their skills. Research shows that workers are not fully compensated for the trade-off between preferences and the job offers that employers make. Monopsony power impacts not just some workers or some labor markets, but the entire economy. One illuminating example is the growth of Walmart, the largest private sector employer in the country. Research finds that because of Walmart's immense market power and corresponding ability to keep wages low, the opening of a Walmart supercenter pushes down both earnings and employment across the county where it was opened. Structural racism and sexism also shape these labor market dynamics. Black, Latino, Indigenous, and women workers of all backgrounds often have few outside options, immense child and elder care responsibilities, and less money to fall back on during spells of unemployment, meaning they have less chance to fairly find a well-paying job. And mainstream economic orthodoxy argues that wages are set by competitive forces. This line of argument leads to the false conclusion that policies that supposedly constrain market forces would limit the ability of the invisible hand to ensure that talent and resources are efficiently allocated across the economy. Yet research indicates that the US labor market is anything but competitive, leading to lost opportunity for economic growth. In fact, and this is another really important point I want to make, one insight of the monopsony framework is that raising wages and increasing worker power can increase both earnings and the total number of jobs. Research supports this too. In the Walmart study I referenced, increasing the minimum wage in counties with a Walmart supercenter led to overall earnings and job increases across the entire local labor market there. Addressing the imbalance of power in the US economy requires a policy agenda that addresses both competition policy and labor policy. Addressing both does more than either can do alone, leading to real wage increases for workers and more efficient outcomes. To address corporate power, policymakers should reinforce the power of our antitrust authorities and adopt a whole government approach to increasing competition. And to build worker power, we must enhance the ability of workers to negotiate collectively for improved wages and working conditions, which my colleague Dr. Heidi Sherholz will address in her testimony. We should also raise the minimum wage and explore the possibility of wage boards. Finally, giving workers protections against harm such as harassment and discrimination, and ensuring that all people have a minimum standard of well-being provided through income support programs like unemployment insurance, SNAP, and childcare subsidies will be a stable foundation for a dynamic labor market. Addressing the imbalance of power means using policy to improve worker and family outcomes so corporations can't exploit their power and ultimately limit US economic growth and resiliency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bourne. Dr. Sherholz, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chair Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this really important topic. Dr. Bourne has very effectively documented how labor market concentration and other forms of monopsony power are pervasive and harmful to workers. In my testimony, what I'm going to do is focus on how unions and collective bargaining are an important counterbalance to those dynamics. Unions reduce the wage-suppressing effects of corporate power by providing countervailing power to workers. Unions just make it harder for employers to use their power to pay workers unfairly. One thing I do want to say is some policymakers might actually express concern at the idea that the negative impacts of one departure from a competitive market, like labor market concentration, should be countered by introducing another departure, like unions. The field of economics is very, very clear that that concern is totally misplaced. Once there is any departure from perfectly competitive markets, efficiency can well be increased by further departures. In other words, unions can restore efficiency to a labor market that is inefficient because of corporate concentration or other forms of monopsony power. When workers are able to form a union and collectively bargain, their wages, benefits, and working conditions improve. On average, a worker covered by a union contract earns 10.2% more than a similar worker who is not in a union. So to put that in perspective, the academic literature finds that wages on average are about 20% lower than they would be if we didn't have corporate concentration and other forms of monopsony power. So that 10.2% union premium is a solid, if partial, counterbalance. And union workers don't just have higher wages, they're also more likely than their union counterparts to have employer-sponsored health insurance, employer-sponsored retirement plans, paid leave. Even further, non-union workers benefit from the presence of unions. When union density is high, unions essentially set standards that non-union employers must meet in order to get and keep the workers that they need. So this combination of the direct effect of unions on union members and the spillover effect to non-union workers means unions really are an important counterbalance to corporate concentration and other forms of monopsony power. However, the share of workers represented by a union dropped by well over half from 27% to less than 12% between 1979 and 2021. What that means is that the vital counterbalance to corporate concentration and other forms of monopoly power that unions provide has been greatly diminished. And this has greatly contributed to the rising inequality and slow or stagnant wage growth for working people that has marked our economy for most of the last 4 decades. To me, it brings to mind hearing public commentators in recent years saying things like, we didn't really know we needed unions until they were gone. And I do want to step back and say, unions are far from gone. In 2021, there were nearly 16 million workers represented by a union, but unions have been seriously weakened. The good news is that that can easily be reversed with different policy choices. So for one thing, the decline in unionization was not because workers don't want to be in unions anymore. In the 4 decades between the late 1970s and the late 2010s, the share of non-union workers who said they would vote to unionize if they had the chance rose from 1/3 to nearly 1/2. And that doesn't even take into account the sort of very recent increase in union popularity. It is also important to note that the decline in unionization in recent decades was not the sort of natural outcome of a modern economy or just the shift from manufacturing to services, which has played a surprisingly small role in the decline of unionization. Instead, the decline of unionization is primarily the result of fierce corporate opposition that has suppressed workers' freedom to unionize. Aggressive anti-union campaigns used to be waged only by the most anti-union employers, but now they're just the norm. And though the National Labor Relations Act makes it illegal for employers to intimidate, coerce, or fire workers in retaliation for organizing, the penalties are so weak they do not provide an actual economic disincentive for that illegal union, for illegal union busting. It's just like a cost of doing business for these companies. Employers are charged with illegal conduct in a huge share of union elections, and that doesn't even count the union suppressing activities employers regularly engage in that are perfectly legal under current law. Despite these relentless attacks on unions, an update to labor law to rebalance the system has not happened. We cannot now allow political impasse to shape the economy as we build out of the pandemic. It's crucial laws get passed that promote unions and restore a fair balance of power between workers and their employers. Sorry for going over, and I will
Thank
turn
you,
it over.
Dr. Sherholz. We'll have a chance to bring out some of these themes. Mr. Mitchell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Michael Mitchell. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative, an economic policy think tank dedicated to advancing a coherent economic worldview that produces broadly shared prosperity and abundance for all. My testimony today will focus on 3 key points. First, corporations are seeing record profits despite rising input costs, inflation, and supply chain snarls. Second, corrosive concentrations of corporate power have allowed for profiteering, which is taking a toll on consumers. And third, small businesses are struggling mightily to compete as big corporations use their outsized market power to rig the system in their favor. Groundwork Collaborative has examined hundreds of corporate earnings calls and has found that in sector after sector, corporate executives are bragging about their ability to engage in aggressive price hikes, all without the risk of losing customers. On these earnings calls, executives note that they can blame higher prices on inflation and geopolitical conditions. Unsurprisingly, they do not mention the real reason they can jack up prices on consumers and families around the country, because they operate in highly concentrated markets with little to no competition. The pandemic has been incredibly lucrative for big business. Nearly 2/3 of the biggest publicly traded companies reported higher profits last year than in the previous years before the pandemic. Newly released BEA data shows that in 2021, corporations saw the largest annual increase in profits since 1976. More importantly, corporate revenues increased well above the additional costs businesses have taken on as a result of the pandemic. Profit margins rose 40% last year and are at the highest levels in the past 70 years. These record profits have come at the direct expense of consumers, workers, and small businesses. Gas prices for consumers increased by roughly 50% over the course of 2021, and these figures predate the conflict in Eastern Europe. Despite the significant hardship that higher gas prices inflict on families, oil producers, at the demand of their shareholders, have refused to increase supply to respond to the supply chain issues that are inflating gas prices. As a result, last year, the three biggest U.S. oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Marathon Petroleum, saw profits increase by almost $90 billion. Gas is far from the only example. Across companies and across products, large corporations are bragging about their ability to raise prices beyond rising costs. For consumers, this includes price increases on essential items such as groceries, diapers, and household cleaning products. Yet even as families struggle to make ends meet, corporations are turning the screws. But corporate concentration not only harms consumers, it also harms small businesses who face unique challenges as they fight to survive in deeply consolidated markets occupied by mega corporations. As demand has increased and supply chains have been unable to keep up, small businesses have struggled to maintain inventory. As a result, these businesses must spend additional time and resources trying to source products. A survey of small businesses released by Goldman Sachs found that 69% of small businesses said the supply chain issues were negatively affecting their bottom line. Size not only prevents small businesses from navigating supply chain struggles, it also prevents them from acquiring inventory as large corporations throw their weight around in order to jump to the head of the line with shipping companies. For example, in late 2020, Walmart, which controls nearly a quarter of the grocery industry, sent a memo to its suppliers announcing that in early 2021, vendors who didn't complete 98% of Walmart's orders on time and in full would be fined 3% of the order's cost. Suppliers have little bargaining power to push back against such demands and must prioritize orders to mega corporations at the expense of small businesses. Suppliers also have little ability to raise costs on big box retailers. As a result, the only option for suppliers is to raise their prices on other customers, namely smaller businesses. A survey released in March this year from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance supports this claim. 65% of small businesses said that a top challenge was big competitors strong-arming suppliers and receiving special discounts, which in turn delays shipments to small businesses and forces suppliers to charge them more. Congress must do its part to address corporate concentration and the power that these megacorporations exert on consumers and small businesses. This includes enforcing laws that are already on the books when anti-competitive behavior reaches the threshold for price fixing and collusion, ensuring corporations are paying their fair share of taxes, making long overdue investments in our supply chain infrastructure to ensure that large corporations cannot game the system and use their market power to rig the playing field further in their favor. We should no longer delay the important work of reorienting our economy towards the people who keep it going: consumers, workers, and small businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Dr. Singer, you now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'd like to use my time to address how market concentration affects consumer prices. When companies are allowed to gobble up their closest competitors, consumers lose outside options for purchases, making consumers more vulnerable to a price hike. Concentrated industries also are more susceptible to coordinated pricing. It is easier to coordinate with 3 rivals in an oligopoly than with 30 in a competitive industry. Now, inflation solves a would-be cartel's coordination problem by making consumers more amenable to price increases and by providing a focal point for pricing. When we observe episodes of massive parallel price hikes that cannot be explained by rising costs, as we did in 2021, we should understand those price hikes through the prism of market power. U.S. firms are doing much more than just passing along costs dollar for dollar. Otherwise, their profit margins would be shrinking, not growing. In 2021, U.S. profits jumped 25% to a record high. Yet too many in my profession are quick to blame workers for the pricing decisions made by their employers. These economists suggest that labor markets are running too tight. Workers are making unrealistic wage demands, and firms are defensively raising prices to accommodate these wage demands. This blame the worker mentality is contradicted by the lack of any correlation between wage growth and inflation by industry in 2021, as shown by Josh Bivens of EPI. Now, my written testimony presents new empirical results indicating that the largest price hikes in 2021 tended to occur in the most concentrated industries. For example, in meatpacking, just 4 firms controlled 84% of domestic revenues in 2020, and prices in that industry jumped by a staggering 28%. These results lend credence to the hypothesis that the current bout of inflation reflects, at least in part, the exercise of market power. Now, up through the late 1960s, there was a consensus in the economics community that concentration increased profitability and facilitated collusion. In the early 1970s, however, certain economists associated with the Chicago School began muddling this understanding, insisting that the correlation between profits and concentration did not reflect oligopoly behavior, but instead reflected cost advantages to superior firms that came to dominate an industry. This rewriting of the very meaning of concentration and the subsequent adoption of this view among industrial organization economists of all political stripes allowed the Chicago School to remake antitrust to cater to concentration. Without a unifying empirical model that revealed concentration's pernicious effects across industries, merger review would become a series of bespoke models that were unique to each industry, controlled by economic insiders. Now, one of the reasons that firms in concentrated industries can turn small bouts of inflation into large bouts of inflation is because they can. And they are even willing to explore the boundaries of collusive behavior, including egregiously announcing their intentions to raise future prices on earnings calls because there are little consequences. When it comes to price fixing, courts give great deference to defendants in the absence of smoking gun evidence of an agreement to fix prices. My written testimony offers concrete policy prescriptions that would address this gap in antitrust law. I am calling for a change in the presumption and associated burden of proof in price-fixing cases once plaintiffs have established certain evidentiary criteria, such as parallel price hikes and the sharing of future price intentions. Finally, courts should be permitted to sanction corporate executives who participated in any price-fixing conspiracy by barring the executives from working in the industries. Until executives understand that they personally bear liability for trying to orchestrate a conspiracy, we will be bombarded with more invitations to collude via the public airwaves and ever-increasing prices. Thank you for having me here, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. Mr. Bourne, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Chair Himes, Ranking Member Style, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. You know, prior to the pandemic, US unemployment plunged to 3.5%. Its lowest level in 5 decades. Earnings growth for workers exceeded growth for managers, and those without bachelor's degrees saw faster growth than those with them. But there's been a paradox. The stronger the jobs market got before the pandemic, the more emboldened calls for transforming it. Whether it was a $15 federal minimum wage, overhauling union laws, or smothering the gig economy, many told us that huge structural problems necessitated labour policies to empower workers. Now, economists, we have different labour market models to assess such proposals. At one end, as we've heard, is a perfectly competitive labour market in which all workers are paid their full marginal value product. At the other end is monopsony, where a single buyer of labour can depress wages and employment below competitive levels. In reality, both models are intellectual curiosities. Workers aren't the same, nor do they have perfect information and mobility. Likewise, most towns and cities don't have one dominant employer. In the real world, labour markets lie on a spectrum between being monopsonistic or competition-y, with businesses holding more power where workers are less mobile, value their specific work environments, or suffer from asymmetries of information. Now, progressives believe that monopsonistic labour markets are the most pervasive, and that certain policies can raise wages and correct for this perceived power over workers without cost. My simple message today is that though real labour markets aren't perfect, they certainly aren't perfectible by governments. And the empirical evidence on policy suggests that the proposals we've heard about today so far to mitigate monopsony may actually harm many workers. So take the $15 federal minimum wage. It's true that in a monopsonistic labour market, a skillfully set minimum wage can theoretically raise both employment and wage rates, so raising pay and lowering product prices. Yet economists David Newmark and Peter Shirley's review of research since 1992 showed just 6% of studies find positive effects on employment of minimum wage rises, against nearly 80% that found a negative effect. What's more, many studies, including of McDonald's, childcare, and restaurants, have found minimum wage hikes have led to higher prices. These empirical findings suggest that even existing state minimum wage hikes quite often raise wages beyond levels correcting for any monopsony power, so reducing job opportunities for young and unskilled workers and harming output. Now, a federal minimum wage would be a strange tool to correct for localised monopsony power in any case. Why would market power in rural Mississippi's labour market require exactly the same corrective minimum wage as urban Maryland? The very best case for using minimum wages to combat monopsony power is as low floors in very local labour markets, not as a federal policy. Similar empirics cast doubt on the efficacy of other ideas. Again, theoretically, trade unions can offset monopsony power if it's real monopsony power. In reality, the strongest empirical result is that union presence tends to reduce job growth at the firm level. Now, is that surprising? There is no reason to expect unionisation will occur solely at firms with monopsony power, nor that union power will perfectly balance monopsony power. What we do know is that unionised firms tend to struggle with maintaining investments in capital or R&D. So rather than these blunt policy tools to try to correct for a theoretical problem, politicians would be better off focusing on two broader ambitions to help workers and their families more directly. First, undo existing government policies that make workers less mobile by occupation and geography. I'm heartened that this administration recognises that stringent occupational licensing laws and restrictive zoning and land use planning practices can dampen worker mobility and are in need of reform. It's not surprising to me that case studies of monopsony power are most convincing in healthcare, where licensing and entry regulations, such as certificate of need laws, grant hospitals more localised monopsony power. A second line of thinking would recognise that while wages are of course important to working households, what matters to families is how far those wages go in providing a decent standard of living. Inflationary macroeconomic policies are what's driving up living costs today, but government policies raise the structural level of prices for products poorer households spend disproportionately on. Liberalising zoning, deregulating childcare, removing tariffs on food, clothing and footwear, and opening up government procurement processes would make a paycheck go further by lowering prices without the damaging consequences of wage controls or more unionisation. So I thank again the committee for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Bourne. I now recognize myself for questions, and I want to use my time to explore both the question of labor markets and prices. Let's start with labor markets. I'm really interested in, if we talk about the labor market as a whole, it's like, you know, the blind and the deaf person touching the elephant. You can see what you want to see. So I'm really interested in where the problem is, where there are clearly uncompetitive labor markets that demonstrably result in lower wages or other worse working conditions for workers. Dr. Bourne, you said 20% of workers are subject to uncompetitive labor markets. Give me just a minute or two describing where those are and what they look like.
So geographically, 20% is. So the stat I said was 60% of labor markets, but it covers 20% of employment. So inherently that means it is going to be rural areas, rural labor markets with fewer workers that you're going to see a lot of these impacts of concentration. But that's not the only place. Also, I would look at industries as well. So particularly a wide body of research finds that the healthcare industry is particularly concentrated. For example, if you look at hospital mergers, which we know are quite common, one research paper that looks at hospital mergers finds that after a merger, nominal wages decrease by 6.3% for healthcare workers, including nurses, and 4.1% for other skilled workers. And so healthcare in particular is one of those industries that I would look at, as well as rural areas.
That's great, thank you. I mean, my interest here is you know, the two parties will argue over a minimum wage. Well, they'll argue over legal support for unionization. But in those areas where there is clear and demonstrable power being used to suppress wages, we have other tools, and we should explore what those are. So, healthcare industry, interesting. That is a consolidating industry. Talk a little bit more about rural. That's intriguing to me. Who are the employers in rural markets that are exercising undue market power?
Walmart, as I brought up, is a good example. Some of these sort of large dominant employers in rural areas, just by sheer virtue of the fact that there are few workers there, they open up and they operate essentially as a company town. And it's just sort of, again, an intrinsic nature of what a rural labor market's going to be like. You can't say, let's open another super center in the same town, because then that will increase wages, because it's just a smaller place. They can't, serve that many customers.
So let me ask you to address what I would anticipate might be, I'm going to make this up, but might be Walmart's response, or maybe one of my Republican friends will mount it. In a rural area, a Walmart opens. I don't live in a rural area, but I assume there are not a lot of job options. Suppresses wages, but wouldn't Walmart say, but we're adding lots of jobs to the geography? How do we grapple with that fact?
Well, we have empirics, we have research. Exactly the study I cited, what happens is after a Walmart opens, within 5 years, county-level employment decreases, county-level labor force participation decreases, and county-level wages decrease. We see this
Stop on
impact.
that second one. Labor participation decreases.
Yes,
Why-
and
That's counterintuitive. There's a new
Yeah.
employer apparently paying slightly lower wages, but why does labor participation decrease?
because it's hard when you have a dominant employer for other companies to compete against that large dominant employer. It ends up reducing overall economic activity in the region when there's one dominant low-road employer. And then another piece on top of that is because county-level labor force participation and employment levels are declining, Walmart is becoming even more concentrated in those counties.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to talk for a second on pricing power. I'm motivated because in the last hearing, actually, we're hearing a lot about inflation, as we should. It's a big problem, right? And I pointed out in the last hearing that price rises come from the people who set prices. That is to say, business. Consumers don't get to choose the prices they pay. Now, I was accused by one Mr. Alfredo Ortiz of showing apparent economic ignorance. I'll plead guilty to that. I don't have an economic PhD. But let me address what I think is a slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about inflation that gets to profits. A business has inputs, and when the price of those inputs go up, one response, and I don't want to frame this in ethical or moral terms, but one response is to say, hey, I want to preserve my a priori profitability, so I have to raise my prices to account for higher input prices. Again, I don't want to frame this in moral terms, but then there's another thing that might happen, right? Which is that you might raise prices more than the cost of your inputs. What happens when I do that? Dr. Singer, what happens if I raise my prices? What happens to my income statement if I raise my prices more than the cost of my inputs?
So your margins obviously go up, and we're seeing that in the data. as
Margins go up. Margins mean profits, right? My
Correct.
profits go up.
Correct.
So again, I sort of shy away from moral terminology, but one might excuse a business owner because the cost of wheat at a bakery is higher from raising the cost to reflect the higher cost of wheat. But if the profits of that bakery go up in that environment, it's because they're raising prices more than the increase in the cost of inputs. Is that correct?
Correct.
So let's explore, again, I'm a little uncomfortable with the framing, but you could never blame a business person for trying to preserve margins, I suppose, if they're not experiencing excess profits. But I saw an article, Larry Summers and Ezra Klein going back and forth on this issue, and I saw a fact, maybe somebody will validate it for me, that corporate profits have risen from an annual rate of $1 trillion a year, roughly speaking, to $2 trillion, doubled. So doubling of profit. So is it fair to say that a chunk of CPI increase, and maybe somebody can help me with how much, a chunk of CPI increase is business owners, large and small, raising their prices well beyond the increase in the price of their inputs? Is that a fair conclusion? Again, I'm economically ignorant, so I need the PhDs at the table to validate that for me.
It's very fair. In fact, a large portion of the CPI increase is attributable to price taking and profit taking. Absolutely.
Okay. So again, we use the word greed, but the reality is that from the big corporation to the furniture store down the street, you now can raise your prices higher because you have consumers with money and there's supply chain blockages that make it hard to get more furniture. You have the option to increase prices, but you don't have to do that. Is that correct? Because by saying you don't have to do that, you don't have to do that to stay in business to cover the cost of increased inputs, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Does anybody have an estimate, last question, as to if I was to ask you to divide, using my two categories, CPI into price increases associated with higher input costs and price increases not associated with higher input costs, but with additional profit, what would the breakout be?
I've seen one estimate by Matt Stoller, I think, in a blog, Big, but I can't remember the number, but it was a pretty substantial portion, and he did exactly the calculus that you're speaking of.
Okay.
It was the majority of the price increase was
I think
attributable
that's
to
an
profit
important
taking.
number, and I have a suspicion that Mr. Stoller may be watching this hearing, so we're going to recognize the work he does, get him to provide us with that number, and with that, I will yield 5 minutes to, or yield time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Let's dive in. One area that I find interesting is when we discuss the corporate profit-taking theory for inflation and ignore the vast amount of spending that we see here in Washington, D.C., suddenly we stop a lot of our comparisons to peer countries across the globe. And so, Mr. Bourne, is the inflation in the United States and in the Eurozone prior to the pandemic, has the inflationary environment tracked pretty closely together between the U.S. and the Eurozone?
Reasonably well, yes.
Yeah, reasonably well. And then following the passage of the American Rescue Plan, mass amounts of spending in the U.S. economy, has the inflation continued to track pretty closely?
No, the inflation diverged such that there was much more significant inflation in the US in the intervening period after that. And that's not surprising because the overall pandemic support in the US was one of the highest in the world, 27% of GDP.
You're jumping the gun on me, which is good because you see where I'm going here. And one of us has feedback, and so maybe we'll jump on and off of Mike's. But when you see that huge jump in prices in the United States, you don't see it in Europe. Many of our witnesses have continually noted that the rationale for rising prices is increase in profit taking. Let's say we take that theory on its merits and just dive in and look at it a little more. Is there a reason that U.S. companies would be profit taking when our European companies would not be?
I'm quite surprised to hear the tenor of this debate because it used to be Keynesian orthodoxy that the way to jumpstart the economy was to have lots of demand, which would feed through into higher prices and more profitability for businesses and stimulate investment. Now we appear to be people who used to, propose Keynesian stimulus solutions now appear to reject that and be blaming the companies for raising prices.
But let's dive in a little more. Was there significant price increases prior to the pandemic in the United States?
No.
Okay, so we're going to play this game of muting back and forth here, apparently. But prior to the pandemic, we didn't see massive price increases, which would, if we took some of the arguments made at the table, you'd say that profit taking then wasn't being driven up. So something changed. Then we see this massive jump in inflation starting, interestingly, about January 2021. And so I would ask, is there any laws or policies in the Biden Department of Justice that you've observed that has allowed, as theorized, massive profit taking in the United States, uniquely a law or a policy change in this administration?
No, I think there's two big reasons why we've seen some inflation. Some is a structural increase in the level of prices due to the disruption of the pandemic. But I think given the productive potential of the economy was constrained by the pandemic, the stimulus was far too large and generated some of that additional excess inflation.
Thank you very much. Let me shift gears because we talked a little bit about the impact on some of these large companies have on the labor markets. I want to park that for a second, and it's a worthwhile spot to explore. Talk about it on the impact that it has on the consumers and standard of living. When a large big box store comes into a more rural community, what's the impact on consumers' standard of living? We're going to get to labor in a second, but the consumer standard of living.
Walmart is a progressive success story. That's not my line. It's the line of former President Obama, Chief Economic Advisor Jason Furman. When Walmart opens stores in local areas, they tend to reduce food prices and consumption expenditure on food pretty significantly, sometimes by 5 to 10%.
So you can see a 5 to 10% reduction in costs of products for families when a large big box store comes into their region. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
I just think it's something that is worthwhile thinking about while we look at the impact that some of these do. I know we can play around with the numbers. One interesting you, Mr. Singer, had an interesting scatter plot that you put together on firm concentrations using NICS codes. To me, a bit of an interesting approach. It shows some level of correlation. I'd love you, Mr. Bourne, if you got a chance to review that, what your take was on the data from that.
I'm very skeptical of these types of concentration measures as a whole, mainly because actual product markets, relevant product markets to consumers tend to be extremely local. These are all national measures. I believe the scatter plot put together by Dr. Singer only looks at publicly traded companies, which I believe there are around 5,000 in the US, but obviously millions and millions of small businesses competing with them as well.
So fair enough. There's different ways to look at the data. I appreciate your take on that. In particular, prior to my final series here of questions, we're really diving into how do we drive up workers' wages. We want real wages to increase for workers. I think that's ubiquitous across all the members here. We have different approaches to get there, but I think we're all there. What was happening to real wages prior to the pandemic?
They were going up, not at a massively fast clip, but they were steadily increasing. And to be fair, in the first year or so of the pandemic, they continued to rise as well. It's since mid-2021, since August 2021, we've seen a 3% decline in real disposable income by household. And we're seeing a decline in real wages at the moment, yes.
So prior to the pandemic, we see real wages increasing, sometimes 6-7% on average, and across the board. And many of the demographic groups we're very concerned about on this committee, actually outpacing whites, was blacks, Hispanics, Asians, veterans, women, actually outpacing real wage growth prior to the pandemic. We come into the pandemic, we come out of the pandemic with very different economic policy. We see inflation increasing dramatically. We see real wages decreasing. Yet we continue to look for the boogeyman in the room, and I would offer that it's right before us. Thank you very much for your time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jayapal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's so much good stuff here. Let me just start with Walmart, because I owned a place in Eastern Oregon where a Walmart came in. There was no stoplight for towns around us. A Walmart came in, every mom and pop was driven out, and the prices went down for the first couple of years because the whole point is to lower the price so you can drive out the competition. And then when the competition was driven out, then the prices went up. And then guess what happened? Dr. Bourne, do you know what happened? Just take a guess, because you know a lot about Walmart.
Well, I mean, what you're describing is prices reverted in the long term, and then I know that wages are also going down in the long term. So overall, there's just a lower standard of
Correct.
well-being.
And then Walmart closed. They closed. They moved out, created a giant food desert, no mom and pop businesses. It's now going to take, it's taken about a decade to bring back some of the small businesses that existed before. So I think this is another thing. We don't think about what happens when these big companies, and particularly big box stores, move into a retail area and then shut down, put people out of business, close all the mom and pops, and then essentially have a complete desert, including a food desert, by the way, in many of these areas. And then I want to point out on Amazon, just because this is my home city, we raised the minimum wage. I was on the committee that made Seattle the first major city in the country to raise the minimum wage to 15 in 2014. The wage went up to 15 for big companies 3 years later. Amazon raised its wage to 15 right after that. So I just want to be clear, it didn't happen that Amazon raised wages to 15 out of the goodness of their hearts. It was the government that came in and said, we are mandating a higher wage. And to anybody who says it's hurt Seattle's economy, for the third straight year in a row, we have ranked the top place to do for workers and for corporations by Forbes. So just want to put some of these things into context in terms of the role of government. I wanted to talk about meatpacking, because to me, this is like a model example of labor monopsony harms. After decades of acquiring smaller firms, just 4 companies control more than half of the market in chicken processing, close to 70% in pork, and nearly 3/4 in beef. Dr. Bourne, can you talk about what the effects of that have been on small and intermediate farmers and also on workers in those areas, specifically in that industry?
I mean, it's a really complicated problem, one that I think our current labor law is not well suited to manage, because what we have when we have these supply chain relationships, the dominant company is exerting this downward pressure on the intermediary companies, who then also have to undercut their workers. And these could be small farmers who don't even want to be undercutting their workers, but they do not have the power vis-a-vis these large companies to get a fair fair pay for what they're providing them. And so it is really difficult. Those workers can't even necessarily bargain vis-a-vis their direct employer because that's not where the profit is. The profit is another person above them.
Perfect example. Dr. Sherholz, in my home state of Washington during the pandemic, Tyson Foods experienced extensive outbreaks of COVID-19, resulting in plant shutdowns and even deaths. Can you elaborate on the impact of monopsony power on working conditions?
It's a really good question. I think the way to think of monopsony power, concentration, or other forms of monopsony power is it lowers job quality broadly. It's not, we are more able to measure wages, and so we talk in terms of wages all the time. But think of it as it just has, the employer just has to provide less high-quality jobs to their workers because they're workers for either because of concentration or the many things that Kate described. They just have fewer outside options, so they just do not have to provide high-quality jobs, which includes not just wages but also benefits and also things like workplace safety.
Let me go to this question of what happened during the pandemic and how the United States responded versus, say, European countries. Any of you, can you tell me whether healthcare is provided in most European countries? Dr. Sherholz?
Yes.
And how about childcare?
Yes. Yeah.
And how about when the pandemic started, did most European countries have a program where the government directly subsidized businesses to keep workers on payroll, similar to my Paycheck Recovery Act?
Yes, they did.
Did that happen in most countries?
Indeed it did.
And so to say that the United States put a tremendous amount of support in, too much economic support, as Mr. Bourne has suggested, into supporting businesses and workers during the pandemic. Would that be accurate if you take into account all the underlying support services that European countries already provided?
Right. The U.S. did not do too much. There was plenty sort of left on the table. The U.S. did a lot, but there were plenty of things that could have also been done.
And in fact, in Europe, many of those things were already covered through base services plus programs that existed to subsidize businesses during times of great crisis.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Mr. Donalds is Mr. Donalds has left us, has he? Okay. In that case, we go to Mr. Gonzalez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Mitchell, you discussed the impact of corporate concentration that it has on our supply chain and rising cost, something a lot of people have been discussing. Can you speak more about how corporate concentration leads to supply chain issues, and more specifically, how Congress can take steps to alleviate and mitigate the worst of these issues?
Absolutely. So when we talk about corporate concentration, I think there are two really important components that we need to understand here. The first is corporate concentration effectively hollows out and nearly eliminates diversity in our supply chains. This leaves us without the geographic diversification, without really the productive capacity to withstand when we have, say, shocks in demand, or when we undergo things such as a pandemic. There is no slack, there is no excess capacity to really take on some of those changes. And as a result, we have scarcity that drives up costs. Also, we can look at the fact that when there is high levels of corporate concentration, it leaves us very vulnerable to price gouging and profiteering. So without competition to undercut highly concentrated markets, prices are able to go up. And in an environment where there is inflation, that allows for companies essentially to raise prices with a little bit of a smokescreen present. So it's important here in these moments, especially for lawmakers to be considering the kinds of investments that lead to a more robust supply chain and would allow for a little bit more of that capacity to
Is there an industry that stands out to you overall where this is happening?
So as we've looked at earnings calls, we're seeing profiteering happening across sectors. I think most alarming, especially for consumers, is when we see this happening in places where essential goods, so for instance, diapers, cleaning products, things that households are going to buy regardless. Right. And this allows for profiteering to occur, and there's just too much concentration. There's no alternatives for consumers.
Thank you. And my next question is to Dr. Bourne, regarding the discussion of corporations becoming so large that they influence the entire economy. As you know, can you discuss, I want to ask a similar question, can you discuss legislative tools and other routes aside from the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, through which the federal government can support competition across the economy?
Sure. So, I mean, there's historic and statutory reasons that the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have focused on litigation, but it's possible to take a broader approach. And the way we refer to it as a whole government approach, there's a lot of administrative rulemaking that does impact competition. So, for example, the Federal Communications Commission could institute rulemaking that would catalyze competition in media and communications, or regulations around health and safety could also make sure that innovative new suppliers can get into markets rather than giving an advantage to incumbents. There's lots of ways through rulemaking. But the final point I'll make is that legislation plays a pretty critical role in this, where there's not precedent. It's very helpful to have explicit guidance through litigation or through legislation where little legal precedent exists.
Is there a segment in the economy that stands out to you more than others in this situation?
Healthcare is, I will still sort of keep bringing up healthcare because I think healthcare is it's such a critical part of our economy for a variety of reasons. It's everyone's well-being is important if we make sure that healthcare is competitive, accessible, low cost, but also from the labor market perspective, the fact that it is one of our sort of most significant growing occupations are in healthcare, and we're keeping wages suppressed in those occupations. It is exacerbating overall wage inequality and job polarization.
That's right. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, I think what I'm going to do, since Mr. Donalds is not here and since we've wrapped up pretty quickly, I'm going to, if the ranking member's amenable to it, maybe do another round, and then we'll call it that. Anybody who's not here at the end of that second round is out of luck. Again, thanks to all the witnesses. Mr. Bourne, I want to have a colloquy with you. We're going to set aside these PhDs. I too have an Oxbridge MPhil, so we're going to have a little colloquy amongst the economically ignorant of our own. And I want to ask you just a couple of questions. And what I'm trying to do here is just sort of pull out the economics from the political ideology, because I think the economics are really important here. Are you denying that throughout the American economy there is no pricing pressure exercised against workers due to suboptimally competitive labor markets? Or are you willing to concede what Dr. Bourne said, which is that in rural areas, healthcare, certain industries, there is in fact a wage effect due to uncompetitive markets?
In certain industries, there's definitely a wage effect due to uncompetitive markets, but I think it's problematic and wrong-headed to presume that there's pervasive monopsony power across large sectors of the economy.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure that Dr. Bourne was saying that. In fact, I think she said 20% of workers and 60% of geographies are subject to that. So I wouldn't call that pervasive, but I would certainly call it material.
But those studies that look at labor market concentration at a local level, they don't tend to, when they then compare that to wages, they don't tend to control for the fact that in rural areas, businesses tend to be a bit less productive because there are less opportunities for economies of scale, agglomeration economies. So there are other reasons why there might be differences in wages between urban areas and rural areas, not least that people's reservation wages are higher in urban areas because the cost of living is higher.
Okay, if I have time, I'm gonna ask Dr. Bourne to respond to that, but I've got two other questions. You were puzzled because previous Keynesians are, quote, blaming producers. I think I was pretty careful 4 times to say we shouldn't sort of frame this in moral terminology. That usually irritates folks to my left more than anyone else. But let's set aside blame. I am a Keynesian, and my question to you is, are you arguing that none of the American CPI increases that we are seeing today, none, is driven by pricing power, reflecting pricing power by firm pricing power, and that is reflected in temporarily excess profits?
I cannot say categorically none, but what I can say is you would imagine rising prices and rising profit margins in competitive markets when you have a big macroeconomic stimulus as a first round effect. Then you get the labor adjustments, but wages tend to be sticky. That's one of the
Well,
reasons why.
I'm just talking about goods prices here. And again, maybe this is starting to feel personal to me, but consumers don't raise prices. Consumers provide demand. Firms set prices. Stop me when I say something that you and I disagree on. Firms raise prices. No blame. Firms raise prices. Some of those prices are attributed to more expensive inputs. Some of those prices are not attributable to more expensive inputs and are reflected in increased profits. Do you disagree with that point?
Demand in itself is reflective of people's willingness to pay for a given level of output. So an increase in demand, by definition, is a willingness to pay more for a certain given level of output across the economy.
Yeah, but I'm asking a supply-side question here.
Could you reiterate the questions?
Yeah, I'm purely focused on the supply side. My last question is on demand. Purely on the supply side, firms raise prices. They do so either because they are facing increased input costs and they don't want to go under, or because they have pricing power and that price increase is reflected in increasing profits. That is both theoretically true and is reflected in roughly the doubling of private sector prices today, correct?
Yes.
Sorry, the doubling of private sector profits today.
Economies don't happen statically. So I imagine what's happening with many companies is that they're reacting to higher demand, but also anticipating that as a result of higher inflation, there's going to be greater demands for increases in wages in their firm. So they're getting ahead of that and anticipating that.
Okay. Last question, and I do want to reserve just a little bit of time for Dr. Bourne. Again, trying to take the politics out of this. The United States entered into, under two different presidents, dramatic fiscal stimulus associated with the pandemic, roughly $5 to $6 trillion, outsizing dramatically the UK, Germany, other OECD countries. Shocker of shockers, we have slightly higher inflation than those countries. We also have higher GDP growth and lower unemployment. Do you agree with that, Mr. Bourne?
That is true.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Bourne, let me give you 30 seconds, please, because I was really interested by what Mr. Bourne said about rural markets.
Sure. I mean, yes, there are economies of scale in certain industries, certain types of companies, but broadly, there's just so much ample evidence that the reason there are lower wages in rural areas is because precisely there's not enough competition in rural areas just because there are fewer people and fewer companies there. When we are talking about the link between productivity and pay broadly, I think, the final point I want to make is that we've had a long-term trend of a divergence between productivity equaling pay. So we know it's not just that workers are paid equal to their productivity, and so places where they're less productive, they're earning less, because across the economy, there's a divergence between productivity and what workers are paid for the past 40 years.
Thank you, Dr. Bourne. And with the goodwill of the ranking member, we're going to recognize the members that haven't had a chance to ask questions first, and then we'll come back to the second round for the members who have. So with that, I'll recognize Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, thanks for being here. A couple things. First, the chairman referenced the conversation that Larry Summers had with Ezra Klein. Actually, I had a chance to listen to that podcast. It was quite enlightening, quite informative, and it really got to kind of the essence of our issues with inflation, with wages, so on and so forth. And it was a much more robust and roundabout conversation. I think some people might consider you might hear from Mr. Klein. So, I appreciated listening to it. It was a good podcast. I think the one thing that I did take from it is that central to a lot of our inflation issues is that wage inflation is at the core of all inflation. And so no matter what business you're talking about, no matter what industry you talk about, the central cost associated with any business entity is going to be labor costs. And I think one of the concerns with the desire in one of some of the panelists' policy ideas about increased federal wages or increased federal minimum wages is automation. I mean, one only needs to go to a Wawa or a McDonald's or a Panera, what Panera has done in virtually every store that they run, to understand and realize that there is a pressure point with rising wages that has employers or large corporations start to bring in innovation and be willing to pay the upfront capital costs to deflate the long-term wage costs that they might see in the company's future. One of the things that from the panel that was kind of interesting to me, there's talk about profits from 2021, corporate profits overall, comparing them to 2020. I don't remember who brought that up. All right, so here's my question for you. I understand you're looking at 2021 profits, Mr. Mitchell, sorry. I know you're looking at profits 2021. Does your analysis take into account the fact that labor participation rates in the United States were significantly down in 2021 associated with corporations still doing and conducting their business operations, providing goods, providing services? Does your analysis take that into account?
We look at BEA data that reflects the changes in corporate profits over year to year. So we can look at from a longer period of time and still see consistent increases in corporate profits, consistent increases in profit margins between past years and latest round of data.
But I guess my follow-up to that is that I understand what you're looking at in terms of corporate profits year to year or over a period of years. That's all well and good. But the anomaly that is 2021 is that there was a significant decrease in the labor participation rate, in part from federal policy that was set in February of last year. You only needed to go to any gas station in America and see the paper flyers asking people to come and apply, and you get $500 just for applying. And so it's without question that throughout the business world, whether you're talking about large corporations or small businesses, the amount of people actually participating, actually working was down. So isn't it easy to surmise that because you had low amount of labor actively working, that would also lead to higher corporate profits if corporations or small businesses were still earning the same level that they were earning in the previous year, 2020 or 2019 or 2018?
Not necessarily, no. And again, we can look at aggregate corporate profits have increased. And so we can see just across corporations, across our economy, profits are up. We can also look in specific markets, specific companies that have also posted record profits in those years as well. So we have a range of data that supports both rising profits for corporations, rising profit margins, which would take into account changes in costs as input costs also increase to show that the profit margins are up.
The only argument I would add, and for you guys to go back when you do your data and do your further work on this, is that just looking at the bottom line of a company doesn't tell the whole story of what's going on. Is the company actually taking in the same amount of revenue as they've taken in the previous years? Is that consistent? What's going on with the costs associated with the material they have to acquire over that period of time? Is that consistent? I would argue if you're looking at corporate costs, they rise in the fourth and third quarter compared to where it was in the first and second quarter. I think that's something to understand. Obviously, labor, so on and so forth. The last thing I kind of want to touch on, I'm kind of out of time. I know we're going to do round two, so I'm going to hang around. So I'm going to touch on it, and hopefully we get to dig into a little bit more. Unionization issues associated with not just automation, but innovation. I think one of the key things that we have to understand is widely reported that one of the issues we had at the ports in Long Beach and in LA is that the union has largely blocked efforts to modernize and innovate the ports. So when President Biden wanted them to be open 24 hours a day, those ports simply could not, because A, of the union contracts that didn't allow those ports to be open 24 hours a day, B, union negotiations that blocked innovation at those ports to modernize those ports similar to where other ports around the world have significantly been modernized compared to the ports in LA and Long Beach. I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna yield back to the chairman. Thank you for some additional indulgence. Doctor, I know you wanted to get in. We'll probably get to it.
We'll make sure Dr. Sherholz has an opportunity at some point to respond to that, but now the time belongs to Ms. Capter, 5 minutes.
Very much, Chairman. There we go. And to our witnesses for coming today. I'm going to just ask some general questions, and anyone who wants to catch the ball, please do. I've noticed this one map that you've provided. It's a little bit hard for me to understand exactly what it means, but I'm reading this, that there are certain concentrations in the country. Whose map is this? Okay, you might just explain what is this telling us?
So that map is where it is red. Economists have gone through and looked at the data on job openings and postings by employer and saying how many jobs are available in those areas. And so when we look at that map, it's pretty stark. You can see the Northeast it's much more competitive. The West Coast is competitive, but that whole swath of the middle of the country or rural areas where there's very few employers hiring, and that gives them power to keep wages low.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, maybe you're the person that should answer this question. If one looks at pension funds, a lot of Americans do collect money from their salaries or their companies, and they end up being invested in a pension fund. If you had to pick a part of the country where, or several parts of the country where those pension funds are managed, could you select an area and tell us what it is, or set of areas? Where would those mainly be managed? By firms where?
I mean, my presumption would be that pension funds tend to be managed in financial centers. So that would be probably where like the investment managers are located.
Okay, and like where would that be?
New York City, the New York City area.
Mainly, okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Could anyone answer why, with pharmaceuticals costing what they do in our country, why are we importing all of the ingredients, largely, from other places? Does anybody know? Pharmaceutical companies are growing. They're pretty big now. There's a lot of consolidation. But why are we getting our ingredient? Do we not have the ability to make our own medicine in this country anymore? Anybody know? Nobody got a comment on that? Where are most pharmaceutical companies?
Sorry, I imagine businesses, pharmaceutical businesses, like many other businesses, look to source their products where they're price competitive. And certain other countries, I imagine, have comparative advantages in producing or excavating some of these inputs to the process. So I imagine, this is part of free trade.
Mm-hmm. And where are most of these pharmaceutical companies? I don't have any in my area. Where are they headquartered in our country? Or abroad? Do we have any left that actually are American? That's a pretty important question to answer. Anybody want to take a stab? A lot of money involved in that industry.
Congressman, one thing I would say here, though, that is a concern is that as we have extreme levels of corporate concentration or a desire to financialize in various industries, pharmaceuticals being one of them, we risk losing a lot of the domestic supply capacity that is important to ensuring that we have the ability to create these things when we need to here. So it is imperative and would be a smart choice for our lawmakers to look for ways to address investment domestically that allows for that capacity to exist.
I thought it was rather humorous, if it weren't so serious, when the pandemic started, that the last administration created a term, air bridge. We had to go import ventilators. We couldn't make ventilators. I thought, well, if we can't do that, we're pretty stupid. As a country, sad. We haven't had balanced trade accounts for most of my service here in the Congress, as hard as we fought for those. Not a good sign for the country for the future. Airline deregulation, they said that was a great deal. How come that service in many medium-sized communities like I represent has dried up, and now we got these big mammoth hubs, you got to wear running shoes to get through them? Why is that good for the American people? Prices of tickets have gone up. We had very high concentration. Somebody's talked about monopsony. What's the airline industry? How do you term what that is today in our country? What do you call it?
I'll take a swing at that. I mean, the airline industry has become highly concentrated over the last few decades because mergers have been tolerated, including under the Obama administration. And as a result, it's been easier to coordinate reductions in output and force also in capacity. Now, when you get on a plane, it's hard to squeeze in and go to the bathroom. So yes, landing spots have been removed in middle of America, and now you have to go through major hubs, and that's just one outcome. Another outcome is they've been able to impose bag fees and purport to claim that they're reducing the price of the base fares when in fact there's not much evidence to that effect.
I thank you very much. My time has expired, but it's very interesting to see the trend of our society. I can guarantee you, if you look at a chart, and you'll see that as manufacturing has gone down in this country, financials have taken over as the most important element of commerce in this country, and that's not a winning strategy for the future. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I think something that's really fascinating about this hearing and the topic of monopsony is that it really helps us address two really major economic forces at once. The first being stagnant wages in the face of rapidly rising costs of living. So we have people being squeezed on both sides with lower wages and higher costs. And today I want to kind of examine one of the driving underlying forces that allow this to happen so easily, which is corporate mergers, and an issue that lies directly at the root of both of these interconnected crises. So, Mr. Mitchell, I want to start by drawing a picture of corporate consolidation in the United States to see exactly how bad it's gotten. Let's take a share of the meat processing industry, for example. What is the market share? What is the current market share of the 4 largest companies in the meat processing industry?
The 4 largest companies account for just over 50%, so about 53% of the meat processing industry.
53% of all meat processing in the United States is handled by 4 companies.
Right.
I've got a visual right here so people understand. We've got JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and Smithfield. And when you go to the supermarket, no matter where you are in the United States, it boils down to pretty much 4 companies. Mr. Mitchell, let's now turn to retail. I'll provide the market share percentage for the 4 largest companies this time. It's 35% of all retail in the United States is run by 4 companies. And am I right to understand that Walmart and Amazon alone count for 2/3 of this cut?
That is correct. Walmart is about 14%, Amazon 10%.
So we've got about 1 in every 4 retail purchases, or we'll say in terms of the market, 1 in every 4 is run by 2 companies. Am I right? Okay.
That's correct.
Now, and I mean, I think it's a shocking degree to the amount and the control to which the volume of these industries are controlled by such a small group of corporations, and let alone people, when you look at who actually owns up stake in these companies. Now, a number of my colleagues and our witnesses today have rightly discussed the impact of corporate consolidation. When 4 companies control almost 60% of an industry, the normal supply-demand curve doesn't really set the price, does it?
It does not.
So this whole idea of free markets and supply and demand and all of these things that our prices are fair and price hikes are just the result of just completely natural, competitive environment, that starts to fall away when the U.S. economy transforms into an oligopoly. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
These are assertions of an actual free market with true competition. But when 4 companies run the show, we don't really have perfect competition, far from it, in our markets.
That's correct.
Now let's stick with the example of Walmart. Walmart has opened a number of supercenters across the country, displacing small to mid-sized retail companies in the surrounding region. Now, what does the latest economic research reveal about the impact of these supercenters on wages and aggregate employment? Sorry, Ms. Bourne, my apologies.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a really great study. What it does is look at the exact same places where a supercenter was proposed but blocked versus those that it was open. So we know they're pretty similar economies as each other. And when that happens, within 5 years, wages go down by 5.2%, employment decreases by 2.9%, and then labor force participation goes down by 1.4%. Simultaneously, Walmart's still there, so it's a bigger chunk of the labor market.
And so what we're seeing is that when a supercenter rolls into town and when a Walmart rolls into town, wages decrease and labor participation decreases.
Overall, there's just more deadweight loss in the economy. We're under potential.
And according to the Treasury Department, lack of competition in the labor market, in the job market, costs workers on average 15 to 25% of what they might otherwise make. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. And so another way to put this too is that if a company cut wages by 5%, only around 10% of their staff would quit. So what they're doing basically is making a choice to reduce output, pay workers less because they have a higher profit rate, but they're actually suppressing economic activity broadly.
So when we see these huge companies gobble up massive parts of our market, we get that corporate consolidation leads to both increased prices and depressed wages. Is that what we're seeing from the data?
Exactly.
All right, thank you very much. I yield back to the chair.
The gentlelady yields. The arrival of members has created a multivariable complication for the chairman that he doesn't get. But every member, just so you know, in all fairness, every member will get 2 times 5 minutes, and I'm going to continue to recognize people for their first round. But again, if anybody wants it, you'll get 2 times 5 minutes. But I am going to be a little severe on the gavel so that we don't run over. With that, Mr. Arrington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is one of those topics that I think there's a lot more agreement, at least for me, than disagreement on the premise that market concentration is not a good thing. It's monopoly forces or sinister forces that give consumers less choice. I think markets and I think free market competition is the best way to present the highest value proposition to consumers or to our citizens, just in general, in terms of trying to strike that cost and quality dynamic or inflection point, and then just giving people an opportunity to decide, as we say in West Texas, whether you want a Ford pickup or a Cadillac. I mean, you get to choose, and so I think that's all very positive. I think big government and big business, or the concentration of power in the hands of a few in corporate America, are cousins, maybe brothers. But there is a close relationship with the adverse outcome on our economy and on our consumers. So, I mean, I'm just trying to find some agreement at the outset that we need to make sure that that there are guardrails in this free enterprise system and this capitalist system that prevents that. But I would suggest, and I would love to hear from some of the witnesses, that high cost in government intervention in the form of taxes and regulations is a major driver of a consolidation of power in industry. The small guys cannot afford the cumulative cost of all of these regulations, the trillions of dollars of cost system-wide, and along with the taxes. In some cases, we make distinctions and provide some relief for small businesses, but it happens in every industry. Mr. Himes knows the banking business. I was at the FDIC as chief of staff for years in the Bush administration. And Dodd-Frank, which may be well-intended, and maybe there were some things in there that would do well to prevent the financial crisis that we experienced as a country. Not trying to debate Dodd-Frank, except that the outcome was 1,800 community banks closed after Dodd-Frank or since Dodd-Frank. The big got bigger. The assets that are controlled by, let's say, $100 billion in asset or more banks control 60% of the banking assets in the nation today. Pre-Dodd-Frank, that was 47%. So I think the policies that want to continue to drive the input cost of energy by overregulating this industry that has blessed our economy, created opportunities, low cost to heat your home. Now 1 in 5 can't even afford to heat their home. 1 in 5 Americans. So we're losing our competitiveness and we're losing opportunities. And by the way, when you tax a corporation, just like newsflash to everybody, if they can, they will pass that cost off to the consumer. And you can call that bad behavior. You can wish that the better angels would prevail. You could hope that human nature ceases to exist, but that's just the reality. And so these proposals from my colleagues to increase taxes and regulations in almost every facet of the life of this country will only accelerate the problem that we're trying to solve and that we, I think, probably agree have an adverse impact. That's my big concern. This inflation is not only wiping out wage growth that occurred after more freedom, less intervention and burden on tax and regulation. It's not only gobbling that up, it's creating a disparity between the medium and small businesses and the big guys, and that we're going to see more of that happen the more that we see those sort of policies promoted and advanced by my Democrat colleagues. That's my fundamental belief. So I'm sorry I didn't ask a single question. I came from another hearing, and Mr. Chairman, you were going to be mean with that gavel, so I'm just going to yield right now, hoping maybe we get another round.
The gentleman's time is expired, and yes, every member will have 2 times 5 minutes of questioning. With that, Mr. Davidson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for our witnesses. I appreciate your work and your preparation for this hearing, and I'm glad I could join you, even though it's a little late into the session. You know, I've really appreciated the creation of this select committee because I think it's such an important topic, and I've been encouraged that we've gone out to other parts of the country to see firsthand the issues that are going on in one another's districts. You know, we see our districts, but we can see, you know, in another person's perspective, what are you dealing with in your own district? And I will say, I'm hopeful that we can find more common ground, but as it turns out to be often the case, my Democratic colleagues, it's which version of more government are we going to talk about today at this hearing? Because the same solution comes up every time. We just need more government. And unfortunately, more government isn't solving this. And frankly, we don't really operate the government we have very well currently. And frankly, we also don't pay for the government we have. So that's a big concern. And not paying for it is driving inflation. Now, there was a pandemic. We know there's some supply shortages. And I think everyone that's been to Economics 101, let alone the people with the credentials sitting here at the table, knows the basic definition: too many dollars chasing too few goods. When you produce too few goods, that's going to create a problem. But when you create money that no one even lent you, let alone that you collected in revenue, you're going to make it far, far worse. And in general, the solutions are, let's just spend more money. So with that aside, let's turn to antitrust laws. And I agree, look, the concentration, markets, look, boxing isn't boxing because they stand in the corner and hug one another, right? It's boxing because the referee breaks them up and makes them actually fight. And that's what we have to do in our markets to make them competitive. You know, and that really is the role in our antitrust laws. But on a specific subset, you know, Mr. Bourne, is there a body of law that deals in our antitrust with non-monetary harms?
The current antitrust laws don't just look at price effects alone. They try to consider the effects on innovation and the impact that has on consumers as well.
Yeah, so when you think about some of these things that are, quote, free services, you know, a lot of those, you know, early on, I mean, if you think about Web 1.0, we had, you know, things like eBay, where they took about a 5% rake and you sold your good or service on an auction site. And now we're kind of in Web 2.0 where, you know, at the basic level, these free services are doing 100% rake. They collect all the advertising dollars. It's disempowering consumers. And what effect is that having in terms of market concentration?
I probably differ a bit on the kind of premise of this question. I think in many ways, big companies like Amazon, I know you're probably referring to Google and Facebook, but big companies such as Amazon and Google in many ways have facilitated competition in the economy by making it easier for many small businesses to advertise and target that advertising. If you look at advertising costs over the past 10 years, they've fallen dramatically.
Yeah, I think at a certain level, I'd agree with that. And that highlights the complexity of, you know, just a one-size-fits-all solution. And the challenge of it. But, you know, I'm really particularly concerned about a subset of that market, surveillance capitalism, and the, you know, just assault on the Fourth Amendment. You know, frankly, I wish our country, divided as it is on the Second Amendment, I wish we were as vigorous in defending the Fourth Amendment right to privacy as we are. And granted, that protects the government from infringing on your privacy, but a lot of this goes to third-party doctrine where the government, frankly, compels businesses to collect the data, and then, quote, we didn't collect it, but then they harvest it all for their own purposes. And so what kind of effect is that having in terms of the market concentration? Have you been able to assess that?
Yeah, it's not usually in my wheelhouse, but I think there's a genuine concern that if you have overly concentrated markets in certain areas, then there are potential privacy risks. If Google got hacked significantly, then obviously there'd be more of a risk than if you had many competitors to Google.
Yeah, there isn't very many parts of the federal government that haven't been hacked, and so we think there's probably more in the private sector that's been hacked than has been disclosed because it has an adverse effect on market price, share prices, and things like that. But when you look at Dodd-Frank, to pick up where my colleague Mr. Harrington was referring to, one of the aspects of Dodd-Frank is it did drive up the cost for banks, but who benefited most on that? I think hedge funds and private equity groups benefited the most. They essentially engage in banking activity in a lot of cases where they actually, one part of the firm truly does take an equity stake and they buy something, but then the other part becomes a lender and they engage in essentially unregulated banking activities. That's bought up a lot of small and mid-market companies in a way where these folks had access to capital and the smaller mid-market entrepreneurs and Main Street businesses didn't. So my time's expired. We'll explore this in the next 5.
The gentleman's time's expired. We now go back to the second round. Recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Davidson, for reminding folks that we do some tours around the country, and everybody's welcome to the great state of Wisconsin in a week and a half for a twofer coming down southeast Wisconsin to Kenosha and then up to Milwaukee. It'll be a good visit. Put it on your calendar. But let's dive into round 2 here. I want to follow up where my colleague was talking about, in particular, corporate concentration, and ask you a couple questions on that, Mr. Bourne. When we see consolidation, do you see that directly correlated with wages down and prices up?
No, not really. As I alluded to earlier in one of my answers, I don't really trust these measures of national concentration. Most markets that we discuss, consumers aren't buying kind of nationally. When you're talking about supermarkets, for example, the supermarkets available to you are usually within your zip code, county, whatever. That a Trader Joe's might open or Target open in DC is of no relevance to that local product market that affects you. And the evidence seems to suggest that when you have one of these big companies come into a local county market, they tend to reduce prices, sometimes pretty significantly.
Let's go to the biggest of the big. I referenced in my opening remarks thinking of a Boeing airline, right? My understanding is jumbo jets that we would fly on is pretty much a duopoly with Airbus and Boeing, maybe an upstart coming online in China, maybe in the not too distant future. A big sophisticated company like that, thousands of products pieces are coming into something like that. Is that an area where there could be additional competition? Would it drive down price?
Potentially, yes, but there are significant, obviously, government interests in these major airline industries, in part for defense capabilities. I'm not an expert in this area, but there are big barriers to entry to that sector.
Fair enough. Airline plays into defense. So let's shift off that. Let's look at just barriers to entry, because I think one of the areas we talked about in the chairman, I think, rightly noted, when people come and meet with members of Congress, are often looking for Congress to add barriers to entry to avoid competition. It's crony capitalism at its worst. It's the opposite of what we should be doing in Washington. We should try to make pure competition in the marketplace, in particular as it relates to consumers, because consumers win when there's strong competition playing out. We can get into the labor factor that you have to think about as well. But in particular as it relates to that, as we look into barriers of entry, how does barriers of entry play into driving forward competition in the marketplace?
Well, I think there are 2 types of barriers of entry to consider. One is the sorts of regulations that we heard about earlier from Mr. Arrington. A lot of regulations on businesses have fixed costs of compliance, so they tend to have regressive impacts on smaller and medium-sized businesses. But in the labor market, I think some of the major kind of barriers to entry for workers being mobile are in the form of occupational licensing, which can differ significantly across state, and I don't think there's much evidence that it improves the quality of output significantly. But also local land use.
You don't think that if you're licensed to do hair in one state, you should be disqualified from doing hair in another state? You don't think that's a reasonable?
I think it's reasonable for everybody to be able to cut hair in whatever state they like.
I would agree.
I'm a libertarian, but I mean, the second big area I think that is starting to get attention, and I appreciate the administration is talking about it, is local land use and zoning laws, including urban growth boundaries of major cities. If people had the opportunity to be mobile and move to these areas, their potential productivity, potential wages could significantly increase. But for whatever reason, at local levels, we often make it more difficult to build new housing. And as a result of that, we constrain the potential growth of the economy.
I appreciate that. I actually think that's an area that we could work across. I think it plays into Ms. Bond's research as well, showing in her work the challenges that lack of mobility in our labor force provides different demographic groups, but across the board. And I think that's an opportunity for us to continue to look at on this committee. With a minute remaining, I'm gonna steal what would have been Mr. Arrington's question, but he ran out of time. As we talk about moving prices is we talk about businesses passing prices on. We talked about that earlier, about rising costs impacting prices that are moving on to consumers. When the government increases taxes on a given business, is that passed on to consumers in the end?
Yeah, most economists believe that corporate taxes, the actual burden of who bears the taxes ultimately is shared between workers, consumers, and shareholders. A lot of the evidence appears to suggest that about 1/3 to 40% can be passed on to workers in the form of lower wages, and that's because you get kind of lower retained investment in
Shifting
the
off the
company.
wages, a huge problem as it relates to wages is it also increase the cost of the products?
It can be passed through, yes. I mean, every firm reacts differently dependent on the competitive pressures of the market.
But a significant risk as it relates to increasing prices if Congress is to pass higher taxes.
It can be, yes.
Recognize my time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Kaptur is recognized for her second round of questions.
Thank you. Representative Donalds asserted, if I heard him right, that unions demanding higher wages contributes to inflation. So let's go to gas prices. If we look at the inflation occurring in gas prices right now in our country, is that due to unions? Or is it due to the Putin tax and the fact that our country still remains too dependent on certain sectors for its energy future? Why are gas prices going up? Is that due to unions? Dr. Sherholz, would you like to comment?
Yeah, it's decidedly not because of unions. Like, there's no mechanism where unions in the energy sector are raising wages in a way that in any way reflects the increase in prices that we are seeing. I don't know if somebody else has a better answer on what really is driving wage prices, other than that we clearly have a global situation with energy right now that is driving them up, but I don't have more specifics than that.
Anyone else want to comment? Mr. Mitchell?
I would want to comment here. One thing that we have seen, and there is survey information from oil CEOs that says that right now one of the pressures that they're seeing on reducing supply comes from their shareholders who want to return. So one of the drivers there for rising gas prices is actually a limited ability to expand supply, and that's coming exactly from shareholders and investors.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sherholz, let me ask, are unions at the ports responsible for issues in the supply chain?
The basic answer is no. The issues for the supply chain are the fundamental reason behind them is COVID, right? Like, it is that we have COVID outbreaks around the world that are causing rolling port shutdowns, but the base reason is COVID. It's not anything having to do with unions.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say one of the most fascinating institutions I've been following is one called the Bank of Labor. And I would really appreciate, after the hearing, if you go back to your offices and you look at what they're doing. The Boilermakers, I love the Boilermakers. They really do real things. They saved our lives 3 times in our state from a nuclear power plant that was terribly managed by the worst nuclear power operator in this nation. I won't reveal the name. And, but you can figure it out. The workers have ended up being the owner of a bank in the middle part of the country, and they have an office here in Washington. And I've been thinking one of the roles for labor is to own more of their own investment assets. And this sets us on a course to do that. So I'm just giving the information out publicly, hoping someone will hear me. We need to figure out ways to help this institution grow, because the people that I'm privileged to represent work hard. The oil workers go up on those refineries, 4:30 in the morning in the bitter cold. It's 0 up there, it's freezing. They work their hearts out. By the time they're 50, their legs are bowed and their hands are all calloused. And I'm looking at this and saying to myself, wow, why doesn't America reward this more? Frankly, I think the labor academies in my area, the training academies, should be part of our public school system, where we can earn certificates and community college degrees and make these magnificent training academies. I don't know if you have these in your part of the country, but in my part, wow, they're really good. And they have taken money, their own money, and they have built these academies. America didn't help them. They did it themselves. So I'm looking at the Bank of Labor as the kind of institution that could really grow. You're also intelligent. I ask you to go back and look at it and give me advice. I want to help them expand. And I want to know what I can do as a member of Congress to be more effective at that. So if you know them, maybe you want to comment. I don't know, you see Dr. Sherholz, you had your hand up, I thought.
You know what, I wasn't going to comment on the Bank of Labor, but that is an interesting thing that I'll think about. But I do think the key thing that has been suppressing unions, what that's caused the decline in unionization over the last 40 years, has been relentless attacks on unions. And for that is like the key lever we need to pull in order to really be able to see unions strengthen again. And that's like the PRO Act is what will really move us in that direction.
I thank you for that recommendation. Mr. Mitchell, did you want to make a final comment? No, I thought you had your hand up. All right, Dr.
I'm
Bourne?
happy to make a final comment because I do think Labor's Bank is an important point, and you brought up the point earlier about pension funds. There's a book called Labor's Capital by the economist Teresa Gilarducci, written in the 90s, that gets at this exact point, that labor can use their investment in pension funds to advocate for better policies. And then the last point I'll make is on training as well. I know that much is made of the fact that workers need good training in order to get higher wages, and we know that unions do the best job. I don't know about Boilermakers, but I used to work for a union called SEIU Local 32BJ that has boiler repairmen, and what they have is a training fund that effectively takes people who maybe start as a janitor or a doorman.
But rather than raise the cost of money, they've used regulatory policy. And so that's choked out access to capital for retail consumers. Savers don't have access to a yield. They don't have you can't save money and put it into a bank account. If you want to cool off the economy and you pay a little more to save, that's one way to do it. But right now, my colleagues say the only way to cool off the economy is to spend more money, which isn't rational, or to tax it. And while I'll concede that will certainly pull cash out of the economy and kill the growth rate, I don't think that's really what we want to do, because structurally it's hard to undo. One of the consequences of Dodd-Frank has been this limitation on banks in the regulatory framework. Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for private equity and hedge funds to not be able to lend into the market, but I just want to recognize that when they do lend, they engage in bank-like behavior, and they're not regulated as banks, and that has a disparate impact in terms of who gets access to capital. Has anybody studied that particular phenomena in the market? So I don't think so, and I think it'd be a good hearing topic, if not for this committee, in financial services, where some of our members serve. So let me go to kind of the next topic in here. When we talk about intellectual property in the marketplace, we've seen some of the challenges with our laws, and one of the ways that people build wealth is by developing novel ideas. And when you look at wages, sometimes we've been told at times under the Biden administration that we should raise wages for workers and lower the costs for your business. Mr. Bourne, when you look at the normal income statement for a business and you look at the cost of goods sold, if you raise the wages and the cost of goods sold, does that lower the cost in the company?
A lot of people don't like to hear it, but labor costs are a cost of production.
Of course, they're a cost of production. And one of the ways that you could deal with that is you could get more productivity, and productivity has been hard to model. So what's challenging, if we don't get more labor force participation and productivity is the same, it's hard to grow GDP, right, organically. I mean, we can grow it by inflating it. That's a nominal growth, but you don't get real growth. So how do we model productivity and productivity gains? What's the impact of productivity gains on wages and employment?
Well, there are certain ways to grow the economy. You've mentioned a couple of them there. You know, you have more labour force participation. You could have more kind of capital investment. Or you can have productivity growth driven by innovation. It tends to be a bit of a black box for us as economists. We pretend to know what drives productivity, but actually it's very, very difficult to model. Some of it is to do with general purpose technologies and research and science, but quite how we get to increasing that significantly is very difficult.
Very heavily in bursts, and I just want to close with intellectual property being, linked to this growth and productivity heavily. Part of the reason we've seen so much investment in the United States is not because you have no laws, we have the right mix in general. And I guess that's why I'm so sensitive to seeing that the answer is we get more government, more government, more government. We want our government that we work, some government, to function properly. I mean, because of our intellectual property roles and our capital formation, we led an agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, automobiles, aviation, aerospace, computing, the internet, and now we're in a fintech era and we're really lagging. So we're seeing all this capital formation offshore. I'd love to see us get some regulatory clarity and help this wave of innovation happen in America. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jayapal is recognized for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was so interested to find out the answer to your question in your first round of questioning that I went back and looked for that article, and the estimate is that if corporate America kept the same average level of profits in 2021 as it did from 2012 to 2019, inflation would be 3.8%, not 6.8%. And then if you backed out the normal increase in inflation due to government's normal rate of increase in inflation, then it would actually be 60% of the increase in inflation would be due to corporate profits. So pretty substantial estimate there in terms of what is driving inflation. I wanted to ask about the original topic of this hearing, which is about wealth and income disparity and market concentration. And so, Dr. Bourne, can you elaborate specifically on how wealth disparity exacerbates the harms caused by market concentrations?
Sure. This is research that I've done, and I can send your office a research paper I've done on this afterward, but it takes money to find a job. And so if you are from a background, your demographic background has been historically excluded from being able to generate wealth, it is harder for you to take a spell of non-employment to find a job. It's harder for you to move cities to go to a better job. And so the exact lines, just to be explicit, are it is Black people, it is Latino people, it is women who do not have the wealth to be able to leverage into job search and get a better income.
And if you were to be able to wave a magic wand and say, Congress, these are the actions that you should take to prevent monopoly power and monopsony power, I'm going to expand it a little bit, what would those be?
Oh, I mean, there's a huge portfolio of things you could do. I think, the big areas is competition policy is one, and then labor policy is the other, and you need both. They're complementary to each other. They are more together than they are separately. And so for me, I think of outside options as being pretty critical. And so when we think of workers, what could Congress do to give workers outside options? It is things like income supports, so unemployment insurance, anti-poverty programs, caregiving supports, caregiving subsidies. Giving workers a stable foundation outside of work is not a disincentive to work. It's in fact quite the opposite. It gives them a stable foundation to go into better jobs where they will be more productive, where they will contribute more to economic growth.
Thank you. Dr. Singer, you have written about how inflation can be a cover for price fixing. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And I had this epiphany. I was actually in a trial in December called the Capacitors Trial in San Francisco last December, and we played a videotape of a Japanese executive of a capacitor company telling the jury that during times of inflation, the cartel run much more effectively and can jack up prices much higher because they had a pretext. They actually put out fake news stories to the press and said, it's not us, it's the inflation that's going on. So I nearly fell out of my chair, and it occurred to me that could be emblematic of what's happening writ large in the economy. That is that firms in concentrated industry, which are more susceptible to coordination, are taking advantage of a small bout of inflation to impose large prices. And the thing that really hurts me when I watch these press conferences, the earnings calls, is that they're not just boasting about their current pricing power, which is offensive, but it's fine. But what's really galling is that they're talking about their intention to raise prices in the future. I mean, I hear that as an economist as an invitation for their rivals to collude. And the reason why they do it is because they can. Our antitrust laws have a weakness, and I've tried to elucidate this in my testimony, that make it very difficult for plaintiffs to prevail in price-fixing cases in the absence of smoking gun evidence of an agreement. And so that's why I'm calling for a change in the burden of proof and the presumption, such that once the plaintiffs establish parallel pricing and the sharing of confidential information, that the burden would shift over to the defendants to try to rule out the conspiracy and to demonstrate they were doing it in their own unilateral interest. And I just want to say to Mr. Arrington, I don't know if this is far west enough in Texas for you, but I'm from Fort Worth for 18 years, and I'm not.
And that's East Texas.
Okay, I thought you'd say that. I'm not. I just want you to know that's the policy that I'm peddling to solve this mess. To kind of get a handle on this abuse of power through the public airwaves. And it's not heavy-handed, it's not regulation, it's not red tape. It's, I hope, Republican, Democrat, that if people are trying to orchestrate a conspiracy through the airwaves, right, we have to come down on them.
And just quickly, because I only have 10 seconds, how is concentration, how does it exacerbate the ability to price fix? You said it in your testimony, I want you to say it again.
Yeah, it's hard stuff. I mean, concentration, this is a basic tenet of economics, that a concentrated industry, all things equal, is more susceptible to coordinated pricing. So if I'm trying to coordinate, with 30 firms in a competitive industry, it's very hard. Like, we've got to police everyone. But when we get it down to 3, it's much easier. And so what we should be observing is that these more concentrated industries should exhibit higher price hikes. And I think that's what I've at least preliminarily tried to establish in my testimony. When we looked out, the biggest price hikes in 2021 tended to come in the most concentrated industries, and that is
Gentleman's time has
consistent.
expired.
Great, thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Arrington, recognized for a second round.
Well, I agree with what the gentleman is saying, and I think there's probably some consensus among my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to strengthen antitrust laws. I'm not smart enough really yet on that issue. I mean, I'm a Ways and Means member, so I can talk tax and trade pretty well. But my sense is we're not doing enough. My sense is carrots and sticks alike, and maybe the stick in particular, to your point, needs to be reassessed. I feel strongly about that. It's more principle-based and intuitive, but no, I think the outcomes in our growing concentration of power suggests that there is a problem there, and we're not regulating it. Now, I said it. Regulation. There is an appropriate role for rules of the game and referees in a free society and in free market competition. Okay, now that I've found some common ground, let me go to. Let me flip this over here, though. No, don't you leave, Jai-Paul. Do not leave. She's part of my freshman class, so I want her to hear this. Is this a general? Because you mentioned a general economic principle. I think it's also a general economic principle, Mr. Bourne. Maybe you can comment that if you tax and regulate something, you will get less of that something, and if there's a distortion in the supply of that relative to demand, prices will go up. My colleague, Ms. Capter, was talking about the cost of energy. That's one of the costs that is becoming unsustainable for the smaller guys relative to the bigger guys. If you tax and regulate something, you get less of it. You get less of it, you're going to pay more for it. Now, is that a general principle that we can take to the bank, Mr. Bourne?
In general, we have to remember that some regulations are introduced because they're supposed to deal with some form of market failure, like pollution or whatever. But it's certainly the case that one of the reasons we then tax or regulate that activity is because we want less of it than we'd otherwise see.
Well, and look, I've had to do some soul searching here because I come from the largest ag and energy production center in the universe. And I think that the food supply and energy supply, ag and energy independence has been a blessing to the United States and to the American people. I think I don't think the science is settled, and I'm not willing to bet the country's farm, the family farm, so to speak, on some of the policies that my colleagues are promoting. But I'm willing to say that political science may be settled, and the American people want cleaner burning energy, and they want cleaner air, and they want our production of energy of all kinds to be a cleaner proposition. Like, I'm saying that is what the American people, this is a democracy, I'm listening. But when you have a whole of government, in my opinion, punitive approach to regulating fossil, I mean, SEC reports, FERC, regulations on pipelines, essentially zero over the last year. You just go through OMB directives, I mean, whole of government, along with proposals to tax upwards of $50 billion, and this is intangible drilling cost, depletion allowance, Superfund that's not even going to cleaning up Superfund sites. That is going to raise the cost of fuel, whether you like it or not, and whether you can make the argument to the American people, that cost is worth it because you're going to be breathing cleaner air. I'd like to strike a better balance, quite frankly, but I do think energy cost on account of taxing and regulating this industry, it's not Vladimir Putin, although that dynamic is playing out and there is an effect. But this was happening way before. It will continue to be the case, and it's going to put small businesses and medium businesses out of business, and you're going to have more concentration of power. So whether you have good antitrust laws or not, this is going to be an outcome of the current tax and regulatory program that's being promoted currently.
And just to note, for all the kind of complaints that we've heard today about the price of, the impact of the meatpacking industry and the oil and gas industry, gas and meat is still significantly cheaper in the United States than most of Europe, which tend to have very different approaches and levels of concentration.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is recognized for her second round.
Thank you, Chairman Himes. I think as we look at, particularly when it comes to the issue of corporate consolidation, and we look at what industries are being consolidated, they're not ones that are exactly optional for Americans to participate in. Food, energy, transportation, communication, retail. And when we talk about the concentration of 4 major companies making up 53% of a market, we just talked through in how that can yield price increases. But I also want to focus on the other side of that, which is wage decreases. And to preempt this idea, and I want to revisit something that Dr. Singer, you had just said, this idea that rising costs, this is why we're having record inflation right now, because wages are going up and gas prices are going up and supply chain issues. This is why we're seeing, food go up or general inflation rates going up 6%. And so, Dr. Singer, I'll just ask plainly, and this is something that Representative Jayapal had alluded to, the increases in costs that we're seeing right now, do those correlate with the increases in prices?
No, they don't. And I referenced in my testimony an analysis done by Josh Bivens at EPI that shows that there is no correlation in wage inflation and price inflation by industry, right? It's right there. So there's no correlation. But can I make just one other quick point? When it comes to pricing, a lot of these high fixed cost industries don't even take labor costs into consideration when formulating their price. I mean, think about, does the pharmaceutical company think about its labor expenses when it sets the price of the pill? Does a rental car company think about labor costs when it sets the price of a car? Does Google or Facebook think about labor costs when it sets the price of advertising? It's just, we're so far away from labor costs, and just a huge swath of the economy just is not even entering into the pricing calculus.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as you mentioned earlier, there's a profound amount of overlap, and it's resonant with some of your experiences previously in studying and being involved in litigation with respect to cartels. And when you look at the major areas and markets in the United States, 4 companies leading 53%, responsible for 53% of meat processing. This is a cartel. 80% of soybean processors, that's a cartel. 73% of beef processors, 4 companies, that's a cartel. And it may not be right in terms of the definition of the Sherman Act, but when we talk about that level of market consolidation, it may not be explicit. There may not be a written piece of paper saying we're going to set wages lower or set prices higher, but we all know what's going on here. And, so Ms. Bourne, I want to focus on our solutions, how we fight back, because we have increases in prices and decreases in wages as a result of oligopolies and corporate consolidation. So I want to focus on antitrust and unions as potential resolutions to this. Now, when we talk about unions, corporate consolidation effectively spreads this disease of eroded wages and work protections, but it also erodes the medicine, which is worker organizing. Can you briefly tell us why it's harder to organize a union with a multi-billion-dollar corporation like an Amazon or Starbucks?
Sure, I'll try to be as brief as I can. The first is union busting techniques. There's well documented that Amazon and other companies engage in union busting techniques. And the second is the current inadequacy of our protections against when companies engage in unfair labor practices, that the penalties are just not high enough and firms don't have an incentive to comply with legal protections that workers are entitled to.
Mm-hmm. And what might happen to unions that are already formed or in the process of formations when major companies decide to size up through mergers?
Mm-hmm. It's been documented that mergers are a union busting tool. So there's examples of mining companies merging with each other, and that it leads to eliminating the union in those companies.
And Dr. Sherholz, earlier you mentioned why the PRO Act is so essential in helping protect workers and give them a fair shot at this. Can you point out some of the critical provisions in the PRO Act that you believe are especially powerful and important to that end?
It's a good, there's a bunch of different provisions. Key ones include, like Kate pointed out, increasing penalties so that employers actually have their skin in the game when they're engaging in illegal union busting practices. Making it that once a company does unionize, that employers actually can't drag their feet to get to a first contract, that there's provisions in place that do that employers can't permanently hire replacements when a union goes on strike, and on and on and on. It really would fix a whole bunch of the problems in our labor law, make it possible for workers who want to join a union to actually be able to join a union.
Thank you very much.
The gentlewoman's time has expired, and I would like to thank our witnesses for allowing us 2 rounds of questioning. Really appreciate that. This has been a hearing in which we've achieved what I think I and the ranking member want, which is a good dialogue, lots of interesting but civil disagreement and areas of some agreement. So the committee really looks forward to following up on all of those things. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous material to the chair for inclusion in the record, and I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. The hearing is adjourned.